So we will be starting this workshop, and I am very happy today in the name of the Center for Human Sciences, CSH, and the CPR, Center for Policy Research, to welcome Anirudh Krishna, who's going to talk to us about a long-term investigation of slums in 3 cities of India, Bengaluru, Jaipur, and Patna, which is nice because we don't always hear about some of these cities. And I'm just going to spend 2 minutes to present the speaker. I need to put my glasses, I'm sorry. So Anirudh Krishna is E.T. Thompson Professor of Public Policy and Public Science at Duke University, and he has been carrying out a lot of research on poor communities and in developing countries, and looking very much at the kind of constraint that prevent social mobility. And he has published a number of books on this issue, and is very interested in the conditions of persistence of poverty despite rapid growth. So I think all of you know the manner in which we conduct this workshop. Anirudh, you can have 45 minutes to talk, and I guess we usually take the questions at the end, except if there's really a point that needs some clarification, a very small point. And then at the end of the presentation, we will take various rounds, series of questions. Anirudh, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marie-Helene. Thank you all for being here. I was thinking I'd stand and present, but it looks like I'm going to have the comfort of sitting and presenting. It's terrific of you to come here. It's a lovely, beautiful day outside with high humidity and high temperature, so it's not bad to be here in this air conditioning. Let me see if this device works. Where should I be pointing it? Huh. Some glitch with this. Let me just use that. Does that work? Yes, it works. Thank you. So what I'm presenting today is from a study that started around 7 years ago in 2010 when I went to Bangalore, and I had been a student of rural poverty and rural poverty dynamics before I started doing anything in the urban space. And my earlier studies were all concerned with how people who were poor escaped poverty, but more importantly, how people came to be poor in the first place. And in studying these questions in a bunch of states in India, Rajasthan, Gujarat, Andhra Pradesh, and in some other countries, Bangladesh, Kenya, Uganda, Peru, the United States, I found that more than a third of all people who were poor today were not born poor. More than a third. They had become poor within their lifetimes and had remained poor. And so the question for me became not so much of how do you take people out of poverty, but it became as much a question of how do you prevent people from becoming poor in the first place. These studies also made me see that for a lot of people living in rural areas, no matter which country I looked in, the way out of poverty often consisted of some member of the household moving from a rural area to a city and adding to what the household traditionally made through agriculture or rural labor by finding some work to do in the city. And for about 3/4 of all rural households who had risen out of poverty, the most important pathway had been this migration to a city near or far away, coupled with an additional income that this young man, usually, or young woman was making in the city. That added to what the household traditionally made in the rural area, put them on top of the poverty line, but just about on top of the poverty line. They weren't really becoming rich or well-to-do or secure or no longer vulnerable to poverty. But the important part here was this move to the city, and then the question became, when people come to cities, what do they do? Where do they live? And how does people's movements to cities affect the next generation? if the individual coming into a city just comes in as a construction laborer, what's the frequency, what's the probability with which this person's children rise higher in life? So our city is kind of a conveyor belt to urban middle class status over one generation, two generations, three generations, as some researchers have depicted, or are cities in fact poverty traps, as some other researchers have depicted? So in 2010, I started this study alone in Bangalore, and like any good researcher, I took a list of slums from the government authority, in this case the Karnataka Slum Development Board, and I took a random sample of slums. And to cut a long story short, when I walked into all of these slums, they didn't look slummy at all. They were mostly three-story concrete homes. But all around me, I was seeing, when I traveled through Bangalore, I was seeing much slummier settlements. Those weren't on the government list. What I found later when I probed was that the government list is fairly selective. It gives you a large preponderance of what are called notified slums. The process of notification is a protracted one, which can be compressed, but usually takes 10, 15, sometimes longer number of years. In that process, the slums that survive get converted to better and better places because there's an incremental accrual of property rights, or at least an incremental accrual of the belief that you're not going to be bulldozed tomorrow morning. And so people make investments, and what remains on the official list are non-slum slums. But I will come to all of that in a moment. I'm just giving you a history of this investigation. The study became larger, it became more interesting. I was joined by my Duke political science colleague Eric Wibbles, who added a political dimension to the study. Later by my graduate student Emily Rains, who is continuing to work in these domains. And most recently by Rangaraju Vatsavai, who is a computer scientist at NC State University, which is close to where I live, and by Nikhil Kaza, who is an urban geographer at UNC Chapel Hill. And what they brought to this study was a method of slum identification, which we'd only begun to probe with the help of Google Earth, very basic maps. And they refined that by adding very high resolution imagery analysis and coming up with some robust conclusions. So what I'm going to do is take the next 20 or 25 minutes, no longer, to present some of the methods we used. I can't go into a whole lot of detail. To present some key findings, and finally, since this is the Center for Policy Research, to present some policy recommendations, and then I'll end there and stop for comments and discussions. So we did about 4 rounds of surveys in Bangalore. The first one I just told you about. The second one was informed by Google Earth images. And the third and fourth were involved by more sophisticated image analysis. The studies in Jaipur and Patna we identified a variety of slums using satellite image analysis in the beginning. Satellite image analysis worked quite well in Bangalore, worked quite well in Jaipur, but worked fairly poorly in Patna because it was very hard to tell the slum settlements from the non-slum settlements in Patna. In Bangalore, we had an accuracy rate of about 70%, which was a good place to start. It's not definitive, but there are few false positives, some false negatives. In Jaipur, the accuracy rate was slightly lower, about 60%, 65%. But in more sophisticated ways, my colleagues Raju and Nikhil used very high resolution imagery, which we obtained from Digital Globe, and they ran a series of algorithms on training data, slums that had already been identified, and used those to generate predictive algorithms, which were then used to identify the next sample of slums, which was ground truthed by a field team on the spot, which led back to the iteration of the algorithm and finer algorithms. Currently, we've reached this accuracy rate of 70%, which is very good at the lower end of slums, and I'll tell you what I mean in a moment about lower end of slums, But at the upper end of slums, it becomes very fuzzy because the upper end of slums is virtually indistinguishable from planned low-income settlements. But in each case, the innovation that they came up with was not pixel-based identification, which is the usual way that image analysts use, but object-based classification in the sense that you're not going pixel by pixel, you're taking a group of pixels and their neighborhood to see what the characteristics are, and that's the scientific innovation about which I can't tell you very much more because I don't have the expertise, but if you have a question, I can refer it to my co-author, Raju. In each case, though, what we did after the initial identification of slums was that we mounted field survey teams consisting of local people who were themselves usually slum residents, not from the same slums, but from some slums, with whom we trained intensively for a couple of weeks or longer, and then they went out and did neighborhood surveys followed by household surveys. For household surveys, we picked a random sample of households. For the slums themselves, we picked a random sample of slums based on two criteria. They had to be geographically spread out across the city, and they had to consist of slums of different types. That too I'll speak about in a moment. We spoke to local leaders in each case, both the official leaders and the community leaders. We spoke to a number of brokers and lawyers dealing with the transactions of informal properties, particularly in Bangalore. And in each case, we tried to speak with government officials, and in many cases we were successful. They were very helpful, and they acknowledged the difficulties in which they work, about which also more in a moment. There are 6 key findings. I'll go over each of them individually, but let me just quickly go over them rapidly here. First, the official list undercounts slums. They are relatively better at counting higher-end slums and much poorer at counting lower-end slums. As a result, if you were to look at the average statistics from the government list, including those of the Census of India and the NSSO, you get a skewed picture of slums. You get a picture of a much higher level of living than it's actually there in slums. I'll elaborate on that in a moment. The second thing we found was that a slum is not a slum. There is a whole variety of slums, all of which are lumped together into the ungainly category of slum. But pictures too, these slums look very unlike each other. The occupations of people who live in them are very unlike. Their levels of education are very unlike. The length of time they've spent in the city is usually unlike, and so on. The third key finding was that even though a vast majority of these properties are informal, they don't have formal title, in many cases they're not even notified, they're not even acknowledged to exist officially, but still there is a robust property market. And these property markets are operated, in fact have been created by an army of brokers and lawyers, all well established. And there's a very well understood and well laid out process of transacting informal properties in urban slums. I'll speak about that too in a moment. There's a process by which people in slums are officially recognized and then ultimately given private property titles, the patta or whatever it's called in local language. The process of notification has multiple stages. First, a request is made. If that request is accepted, then an informal survey is carried out. It's informal in the sense that it's very rudimentary. But at the time that survey is carried out, the surveyors list everyone who's living in that slum and hand them out some kind of paper, which is not a title. It's just an acknowledgement that at the time of the survey, you were living here. That then gets processed. There's a public hearing. There's a whole process laid out in the law, and these laws vary from state to state. These laws have been implemented by different agencies in the same state. But then in any case, the law says that the second process is that after all the objections have been heard, there'll be a second survey, after which a second set of papers will be given out, and then there is a final hearing, and then the slum is notified. after the slum is notified, it becomes officially eligible for public services like water supply and waste disposal and street lights and so on. But we found that many slums which had been notified were not getting services. Many slums which were not notified were getting services. After notification, there's a separate stage of private titling. What our results show is that no matter where you look and no matter what you look at, whether it's levels of well-being, sense of private security, asset holding, so on, notification makes a sharp and visible difference to all these levels. But on top of that, private titles add very little, probably because there's a huge confusion among people about what exactly is a title, and I'll speak to that also in a moment. Finally, and this is the most dismal conclusion for me because this is an area of work that I've become fascinated with overall, is that contrary to what some people have written, urban slums are not avenues of widespread upward mobility for the people who live there or their children. On the contrary, there is more downward mobility than upward mobility, and I'll speak to that too. So first, official lists undercount slums. The first time the census of India counted slums across all cities was as recently as 2011. The 2001 census did some initial forays into a few cities and a few slums, but the 2011 census was the first census that makes the definitive claim of having counted all the slums. It does not. It has missed out many slums. Part of the reason for that, which I can go into in more detail if we have this question coming up, is because of the definition that is adopted of slums. The Census of India has a very peculiar definition which has three categories. A slum is a place which is either notified as a slum or recognized as a slum, and then there's a generic definition. And that generic definition is hard to capture. It's hard to translate into exact places and exact locations and exact number of houses. And that generic third part of the definition relates to the bottom category of slums, and that's where this definition goes wrong. And I'll show you why again in a moment. In Bangalore, there are three separate agencies that have been involved with dealing with slums, counting them, notifying them, assessing them, so on. Originally, it was the Municipal Council, the BBMP. Then it became the Slum Development Board, the KSDB. In between, the Bangalore Development Authority also played a cameo role. And most recently, under the Rajiv Awas Yojana, the Department of Municipal Administration mounted a full-scale survey of slums in Bangalore. We compared the three lists of slums. Instead of comparing all the slums on that list, which is a hard job because the names don't match, you had to match by location and so on, we looked at a sample of 75 slums that we chose at random from our set of 279 slums in Bangalore. We found that there was only one slum of this 75 that was on all three lists. Just one. 29 of our slums, almost 40% of the slums in our database, were not on any of the three lists. And all of these 29 slums are low-end slums. I'll show you in a minute some pictures of what low-end slums look like. But before that, here's a comparison of some average statistics from the census and from our sample of 279 slums in three different cities. Admittedly, our sample is nowhere as large as the census, but other researchers have also found similar kinds of evidence about why the census should be treated as an overestimate, a rosy estimate of lives of people in slums. And these are obvious. In Patna, the census says only 3% of people live in slums. That's completely unbelievable if you've been to Patna. All right, let me move on to some other reasons why government statistics quickly become outdated, why the problem is larger than the government is able to manage given its current resources. The situation on the ground changes very, very rapidly. here's one slum that came up over 5 years. All these little spots you see here are tented houses. There's 4 poles and a blue tarp stretched on top. In a satellite image, it appears as these blue rectangles. This is a slum that came up over barren land in 5 years' time and has since become more dense and more thickly constructed. With the standard method that the government agencies have of boots on the ground, of door-to-door surveys, and with the manpower at their disposal, they are absolutely unable to keep track of this gargantuan expansion of settlements in Bengaluru and in other places. Here's another example. The top left picture shows 2 barren pieces of land. That's 2009. Now you see in the same polygons, you see some of those blue tented encampments coming up. That's 2011. By 2013, here's the scene on the ground. They've just merged, these 2 polygons have merged, and there's a whole sea of slum settlements there. This is another thing that's not on the government's list, and there are hundreds of such cases which have come up rapidly. This is not an allegation of incompetence. It's simply an observation of inadequacy, of inadequate resources and inadequate technologies in a situation that is rapidly growing out of hand of the traditional means of government surveillance and recording. So that's what I had to say about my first key finding. I can come back to it if anyone's interested. The second key finding, there isn't one type of slum. I've mislabeled the axes in this diagram, but the horizontal axis is well-being levels as measured by 6 different kinds of well-beings: access to drainage, access to lighting, average home size, etc. And this is the principal component score. And the left-hand side is asset score. If you go from bottom left to top right, that's a rising hierarchy or a rising continuum of slums. The different sizes of dots, the different colors of dots represent slums in different cities. But no matter which city you look in, you find a slum which is at the bottom left, you find another slum which is at the top right, and to go from the analytics to the pictures, here's what they look like. That's a slum at the top right. That's the highest category of slum. This is a notified, resettled slum. That's the first kind of slums I went to study. When my colleagues and I both looked at them and said, "These are slums?" Well, these aren't slums. The point is they're still on the slum register because there is no process of denotifying a slum once it's been notified. This is the second kind of slum, one down. Notice how the construction, while still pakka homes, while some double-story homes, has become more ramshackle. One down from there is this third category, much smaller sized plots, more rudimentary construction, narrower lanes. That's one down 4, slummier. That's one down 5. And then the bottom category we saw, which appeared as blue polygons in satellite images, we just call them blue polygon slums. That's 4 poles and a tent, picture of a god or a goddess inside, some plastic buckets or jerry cans, some earthen stove, rarely a kerosene stove, and these are all slums. Now, let me go back a few slides and show you how they are different. From the bottom end to the top end, there's so many indicators which speak of different lives, different lifestyles, ergo different policy needs. Share of the household budget spent on food is 59%, which is stark poverty almost. In the lowest category of slums, it goes down to something more manageable like 40%. On the other hand, those who should be having a higher percentage of ration cards don't. Those who need them less have them. Men in unskilled manual labor, construction laborers, just basic daily wage laborers, are almost the entire workforce in the lower end slums. go down to about 15% in higher end slums. Almost all the residents of slums are either scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, some OBCs, Muslims or Christians in the cities where we studied that. And that's also found by researchers elsewhere, that the percentage of SCs and STs in slums is much, much higher than that in the general population. The last finding was for me an eye-opener. I used to think that slums usually consist of first-generation migrants from rural. They don't. They don't. More than 2/3 of the residents of slums are not first-generation migrants, but were in fact born in slums. In some of the middle and higher-end slums, we found 4th-generation, 5th-generation people living in the same slum. The percentage of rural migrants is highest in the bottom end, in the blue polygon slums, where it's like 2/3. But if I take all of the slums in the lowest quartile, the lowest 25%, that number falls to 37%. In the top quartile, it's 28%. All right. That's the second finding, a variety of slums, therefore the need for a more nuanced policy. I'll come back to that when I come to policy recommendations. The third finding I'd like to dwell on today is that it's hard to tell without being extremely knowledgeable about the kinds of property documents issued by different official agencies in a particular city about how exactly tenure secure a particular person is. We did this study in Bengaluru where members of the research team went into about 36 different slums, which were selected according to a bunch of criteria, and asked people about the types of property papers they have. We found 18 different kinds of papers that people produced before us and said, this is our patta, this is our property title. There is a type 0, which basically is no papers. That's most of the blue polygons. And then there is a type 1 paper, which is issued after that first survey I was talking about, the first step in notification process. And again, since that first step has been taken by 2 or 3 different agencies at different periods in time, there have been a variety of papers, and I've given some examples of these papers under type 1. There's a type 2 paper, which is issued after notification, and then there's a type 3 paper, which is properly speaking the title to the land. But because of this confusion of documents and because of the fact that properties with all kinds of papers, type 1, type 2, type 3, are all easily and freely transacted, when we ask people, do you have a title or not, the answer is yes, even if they don't have a proper title. They have some kind of paper. Each of these kinds of papers is easily and freely transacted. We went into a bunch of slums where we had been working for 6 or 7 years already. By we, I don't mean me. I don't speak Kannada, I don't speak Tamil, I don't speak Telugu, which are the languages usually spoken in these slums. But people who are my collaborators with whom I worked for 7 years. And they went in looking for properties to rent or buy. In each case, they were referred to a local leader, who in turn referred them to the broker who is working in that area. And the process was very simple. You look at the property, you sit down and negotiate a price, after which some money changes hands, earnest money. Then the documents are produced. Now the documents are in most cases not proper titles. So to convert that informal title into a formal looking pack of sale papers, the seller and every person in the seller's family signs these boilerplate affidavits, affixing their photographs, affixing their Aadhaar cards or whatever identity papers they have. And what they do in those affidavits is sign away all the rights they currently possess, but also sign away all the rights that might accrue to them in the future if the process of of notification rolls on to the next step. Then you can go lay claim to the rights that the seller would have acquired. It's a robust process. The leaders of the area sign off on it. They kind of provide the bona fides that the missing legality makes you look for. The price of a standard one-bedroom house with pucca walls and a cement sheet roof and a toilet, which we inquired into, varies from a low of 1 lakh to a high of 53.5 lakhs, which is not a small amount. There are three major factors that influence the price. One is the location within the city. Two is the quality of services. And three, in that order, is the type of paper you possess. Those are the three factors influencing land prices as far as we could make out. Roughly about 40% of slum dwellers are renters, with this percentage being larger in the lower end slums and somewhat smaller in the higher end slums. The fifth and penultimate observation I'd like to report today is what we spoke about a little earlier. There's a lot of hype in the literature on informal properties about formalizing them and giving property titles, Hernando de Soto and all those works. What we found in our study in Bengaluru was that individual title matters less than collective title, and the collective title is the process of notification. Notification fundamentally and consistently changes people's sense of security. It changes the investment they put into their housing stock. It changes the assets they acquire. It provides them with a sense of stability and permanence. The title, the individual patta coming on top of the notification adds comparatively little. In fact, what it adds is statistically insignificant in the analyses we did. In some cases, the effect is even negative. We can't explain that except by anecdotal stuff about people who live in slums being bought out by others once they acquire a private title and therefore legal rights. But the big point here is that notification matters substantially. And my last point is that slums are not conveyor belts to the urban middle class, and there's a variety of evidence that points to it. We took a sample of 40 slums in Bengaluru and looked at satellite images over a 15-year period for each of those 40 slums to see evidence of physical improvement. In only 3 of those 40 slums was there substantial and visible improvement. These slums had progressed from being somewhere along the middle of the continuum to somewhere along the top of the continuum. Another 4 slums had ceased to exist, and the rest were pretty much as they were with very marginal improvements. That's the slum level evidence of upward mobility. The individual and household level evidence of mobility over time also points to a very similar conclusion. There are a variety of slums, but neither slums are moving up consistently up the continuum, nor are people moving up the continuum of slums. 4 to 5 generations have lived in the same slum. Individuals typically tend to follow their fathers or uncles or neighbors into informal careers. The biggest story of upward mobility is among young women. Unlike their grandmothers and mothers who were maids in people's homes, the younger women getting a class 10 education have become sales girls or work in offices or join call centers, but that's the limit of how far young women go. Young men also, there has been some improvement in some cases, unlike their grandfathers who used to be coolies and manual laborers and factory laborers. Some young men have become mobile phone repairmen, security guards, auto rickshaw drivers. Again, that's the limit of upward improvement. We asked about kids studying in schools and colleges. Most kids study till class 10, some till class 12. Hardly anybody goes on to college. In the top end slums that we looked at, we didn't find a single kid studying in engineering college or medical school or law school or anything that would suggest that that kid was doing something substantially and dramatically better than the other people in the slums. When people move from one slum to the other, and we found about 14% of our sample had at some point moved from one slum to the other, they usually move down the continuum of slum because of financial difficulties. There's hardly as many movements up the continuum of slums. So let me take 5 minutes to wrap up with some policy recommendations. First, I think that the agencies in charge of slums and slum policies should kind of wake up and start getting familiar and adept with modern technologies, particularly satellite image analysis. Very high resolution images are readily available. They're not cheap for a researcher. We spent the most part of the grant we had on acquiring these images, but for a government, that's a drop in the ocean. With the help of satellite images, you can not only track slums as they exist, you can track slums as they are created. You can track them in real time. If people are going to set up a slum on railway land or defense land, and you spot it, you can go tell them, guys, you don't have a snowball's chance in hell of ever being regularized, why don't you move somewhere else? Instead of waiting till they become, two-story structures that have been lived on for 3 generations, and then try and raise them, which is impossible. So whatever you're trying to do, regularize slums, it helps you to track them in real time. The means exist, use them. The second policy recommendation is you can't have a one-size-fits-all slum policy. In the bottom end of slums, their biggest needs, as they told us, were drinking water and toilets. In the top end of slums, on the right, the biggest needs were employment training and waste management. Depending on what people's real needs are, that's what the marginal policy rupee should be spent on. So acknowledging the diversity of slums, there needs to be a more variegated and realistic slum policy. The third policy recommendation is there are informal property transactions happening all the time. People in slums are selling their properties. The only revenue the government's getting out of it is the cost of the stamp paper. That's it. Can we acknowledge what's real instead of pretending it doesn't exist and let there be a win-win solution for everybody? I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what the objections are. I'm just throwing it out as something to consider. The other worrisome thing that we found was that even in the top end of slums, when people are constructing their homes, when people are setting up their business, very few of them transact with formal financial institutions. In fact, there's a larger scale survey by NCAER in 15 different cities which found that less than 5% of people in slums have had any transaction with formal financial institutions. Perhaps that number's gone up a bit in recent years, but even in our surveys, we found that less than 10% even of top-end slum people had dealt with formal financial institutions. It's not clear to me why that is the case. That might be another policy area to look at. Fourth, since notification makes such a big difference to people's lives, and since the formal process of notification is pretty well laid out in the laws, and the reason why there are delays of 10 years, 15 years, 20 years is because of the manpower and the technology, one of my firm recommendations would be to streamline and speed up the notification process. Say yes to the people that you're going to say yes to 10 years from now, 10 years before. And finally, the last policy recommendation, and I'll stop there, is that there needs to be a greater thrust toward promoting upward mobility in slums. It's not rocket science. There are a number of organizations in each of the 3 cities where we work that on a small scale are doing a splendid job of working with young slum dwellers, school kids and college kids, and helping them not just aspire to but achieve higher level careers. entrances to IITs and medical colleges, entrepreneurship of different kinds. And these organizations work through a variety of methods. These are the social mobility promoting organizations we were talking about. And learning from their examples, there needs to be a movement to make their impacts larger and deeper. I'm doing some work with these organizations across India, and I see a lot of hope in what they're doing. I'll end with a bunch of thanks to CPR and all of you first, to the donors who supported this project, to the organizations in Bangalore, Jaipur, and Patna who supported us on the ground, to the survey teams who did a great deal of work, and to many, many, many Duke students who've been coming and helping out over the summer with this project, starting with a couple of really smart students who came out and taught me how to use Google Earth and opened my eyes to the possibility of using these off-the-shelf technologies for fairly simple things. Thank you very much.